Whoa. Oh, this is amazingly sensitive. Okay, hi everyone. My name's Philip Bloom. I'm the director of the Center for East Asian Garden Studies here at the Huntington. Thank you all for being here. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Professor Ruiying Gao's lecture on Materia Medica. I'd like to express my particular thanks to the Carol, Edward, Ariana, and Joseph Wong Trust, and to the Justin Vanya Memorial Fund for supporting our lecture series this year. Before we begin, please take note of the 3 emergency exits, and please also set your cell phones or other noise-making devices to silent mode. I'd like to frame today's talk by providing a little bit of context for our lecture series this year. Some of you have heard bits of this before, but I think these contextual remarks may still be useful for our audience members who are less familiar with the Huntington. As many of you know, last spring, almost exactly a year ago, the Huntington opened the Caiyaopu, literally the plot for picking medicines. This is a small section of our Chinese garden that's dedicated to the cultivation of Chinese medicinal plants. Fundamentally, our medicinal garden is a place for considering relationships between people and plants, relationships that are at once universal and culturally specific. The garden is home to a collection of about 120 species, each of which plays an important role in Chinese medicine past and present. These plants have been divided into a series of beds that exemplify some of the ways that people have used and think about flora. 3 beds are devoted to fundamental herbs, that is, Chinese plants that have been used medicinally for about 2,000 years. One of the beds showcases imported plants, herbs from India, Central Asia, and even the Americas that became part of the Chinese pharmacopoeia through centuries of trade. Another highlights common foodstuffs that are also medicinal, so things like ginger or silk gourd or garlic chives. A third bed foregrounds medicinal plants that have other practical uses as dyes, as pigments, as oils, etc. And the general landscaping of this section of the Chinese garden also points to the medicinal functions even of common ornamental plants. Perhaps most importantly, a final bed in the garden gestures toward the broader philosophical framework that underlies Chinese herbal medicine. It includes plants that represent the 5 flavors, which are correlated with the 5 phases, wuxing, cycles of generative and destructive energy that flow through the cosmos. Collectively, these beds do tell a story about people and plants that's at once universal and specific. Humans everywhere make use of plants as medicines, as foods, as dyes, as ornamentals. But only in China are plants part of such a correlative cosmology that describes the relationships among all things in the world. To help elucidate some of these themes, but also more generally to celebrate the opening of this garden, we're devoting this year's Center for East Asian Garden Studies lecture series to Chinese medicinal plants. When we were conceiving the plot for picking medicines, we looked to a variety of materials for inspiration: paintings, historical villages in China, extant medicinal gardens in Japan, as well as a number of historical texts. Chief among those texts were Materia Medica, that is, guides to medicinal substances. Known as Bencao in Chinese, such books have been compiled since at least the 3rd century of the Common Era. They offer detailed information about the names, properties, and uses of medicinal plants, as well as about their cultivation and growing habits. Many of these books are illustrated, sometimes crudely, but sometimes with intense, color-filled detail. Such illustrated Bencao texts will be the focus of today's lecture by Dr. Ruiying Gao. Dr. Gao is currently Assistant Professor of East Asian Art at Wake Forest University in North Carolina. She received her PhD at the University of Kansas, studying with one of the speakers in our lecture series, I think 2 or 3 years ago, Professor Amy McNair. She holds an MA from Columbia University and her BA from the University of Hong Kong. Her research centers on the intersections of natural history with the pictorial arts, book culture, and women artists. Her current project, which you'll hear about today, examines the social history of Materia Medica images during China's Ming dynasty. She's also interested in Japanese prints, Chinese bronze culture, and the transmission of art within and beyond East Asia. Her work has been supported widely, most notably by the Beishan Foundation in Hong Kong, the Metropolitan Center for Far Eastern Art Studies, the Getty Foundation, and the Hall Center for Humanities. At the end of Professor Gao's talk, which will last about 45 minutes, we will open to questions from you all in the audience. If you're watching online, please feel free to post your questions into the YouTube chat box at any time, and I'll try to pose them to Professor Gao myself. So please join me in welcoming Professor Ruiying Gao to discuss Dazzling Reds and Blues, illustrated Bencao Materia Medica manuscripts in China.
Thank you for that nice introduction, Dr. Bloom. And before I start, I want to thank the Huntington for inviting me, and also thanks Michelle for organizing all the things going on, and also the audience here or online. So in this talk, I will direct attention to images of medicinal plants in China through the case of illustrated Materia Medica books. In particular, I'll focus on manuscripts that are images drawn and colored by hand, compared to prints, which I will also briefly touch upon today. And they are less studied currently, and yet, as you can see here, they're very gorgeous and would form an interesting dialogue with botanical illustrations across the cultures. And we think it's one of the Huntington's strengths in collections. Okay, so to start with, Materia Medica, as Dr. Bloom says, refers to the Chinese word Bencao, a binomial term of many layers of connotations. And in the broadest sense, I consider Bencao a field of intellectual inquiry originating in the study of natural species and materials for pharmaceutical purposes. And some of them we may not consider edible or consumable today, like the cora, or grapes we would consider only as fruits, but both of them are included in Materia Medica because of their medicinal functions. And not surprisingly, approximately 60% of the Materia Medica are plants, okay? And that will be the focus of my talk today. So for today's talk, I will first give a quick review of the history of Materia Medica and Materia Medica books in China. So as I'll show, many of the early examples have not survived till today. So bear with me for the following slides for a couple of minutes that there will be no images, but I promise they'll come back soon, okay? And my focus will be on the Ming dynasty of China through examinations of the image and text relationships in several manuscripts produced in the Ming. I will show how they point to the shared and distinctive interpretations of Materia Medica and human relationships embedded in that topic. Okay. So once again, the Chinese word for Materia Medica, Bencao, first appeared in text account around the 1st century before the Common Era and was already associated with medical studies. And by the turn of the 1st century, a text titled Shen-Nong Bencao Jing, translated as Classic of the Divine Farmer's Materia Medica, was completed. It is the earliest text known today that features Materia Medica or Bencao in its title, and hence has been regarded as the origin of pharmaceutical literature in China. All the later texts I'm going to introduce in this talk today build on this core text of Shen-Nong. However, there's no evidence that Shen-Nong Bencao Jing was illustrated. And the practice of making images of Materia Medica, however, began no later than the Sui dynasty of 6th centuries. A work titled Lingxiu Bencao Tu by a man named Yuan Pingzhong was recorded in historical documents from that time. And to my knowledge, this is the earliest visual material that bears Bencao in its title and was highly likely an illustrated manuscript considering its time of creation. So potentially, Materia Medica was already established as a genre of pictorial representations by that time. And in the 7th centuries, a Materia Medica work of great importance, Xinxiu Bencao, newly compiled Materia Medica, was produced. Commissioned in 657, it is considered the first state-sponsored Materia Medica treatise, or sometimes known as pharmacopoeia, in China. And in addition to 20 scrolls of texts, Xinxiu comprised 25 scrolls of images and 7 scrolls of illustrated commentaries, which is known as tujing in Chinese. Unfortunately, none of the images have survived, and only parts of its text have been preserved in manuscripts found in Dunhuang, Japan, or as quotations in later books. Okay. Yet, the preface in it by Kong Zhiyue informs us the 2 features of its contained images. It says the images were painted by hand with dazzling reds and blues that capture the forms and appearance of all beings. On the one hand, this record attests to the tradition of hand-illustrated images of Materia Medica, and on the other hand, it suggests that epistemic function of Materia Medica images, which is to help the viewer to identify the form and appearance of pharmaceutical materials, was a primary goal for this book. However, the preface does not mention the process of making the images, and thus it's unknown to us whether they were actually based on empirical studies of actual species. In the meantime, Materia Medica images were also noted for their artistic or art historical values. Okay. For example, in the 9th century painting treatise, 历代名画记 by Zhang Yanyuan, the illustrations of Xinxiu are recorded under the category of rare paintings and precious pictures from earlier times. And this dynamics between the epistemic and artistic value of Materia Medica images will continue to show in later works, as I will bring attention to you today. Okay. So going forward, Materia Medica book sponsored by the imperial state reached its peak in the Northern Song dynasties in China, and many were made with images. The most important title was Jiayou Bencao, and part of the book project was an illustrated work of 21 chapters, Bencao Tujing, which was completed in 1061. Containing nearly 1,000 images, Bencao Tujing is considered the earliest example of illustrated Materia Medica books made by woodblock printing. And more importantly, Bencao Tujing has been argued to provide a source for images in Materia Medica books made in later periods. The original edition of Bencao Tujing, like the earlier works, is lost, but its most images have been preserved through another Materia Medica book produced in the Northern Song, 经史证类备用本草, which went print in 1108 and 1116, and both editions survived, yet only in fragments. So here is the most important work from the pre-Ming China, 重修正和经史证类备用本草. Printed in 1249 as a new edition of Zhenlei, it is the earliest complete copy of this 12th century treatise that have survived till today. More significantly, over 1,700 kinds of pharmaceutical materials are included in this 13th century book, with more than 900 illustrated. Okay. So another finding I've been able to locate is across all the books I mentioned so far, the epistemic function of Materia Medica images kept being stressed. Okay. The scholars responsible for compiling Bencao Tujing claimed that they were inspired by the long-lost Tang book Xinxiu Bencao, especially its combination of text and images. As Su Song, the editor-in-chief of Bencao Tujing, wrote, in the past, during the Yonghui era of the Tang, in addition to editing and collating Materia Medica texts, there were also illustrated commentaries to complement the text. The images are used to show the appearance and color, and the commentary serve to explain their similarities and differences. Okay? And to achieve the objective of credible representations, it is also recorded that Song imperial court commanded local governments across the state to conduct systematic fieldwork on pharmaceutical materials in their administrative areas, and also to make images of them to be submitted to the central government. Suzong even demanded that these images must be based on first-hand observations of actual pharmaceutical materials. He expected that through the combination of accurate images and explanatory texts, Bencao Tujing would provide reliable reference to its readers on how to identify and select proper pharmaceutical materials for desired therapeutic effects. Okay? And moving on to the 13th century, the publisher of Chongxiu, Zhang Cunhui, stated again that his motivation was to replace the images that have lost credibility with what I have seen, so that the book could clarify confusions about pharmaceutical materials, which were vital to human life and well-being. Okay. Images in his book, here they are finally back, images. Images in his book delineated by crisp line work of meticulous details, as you can see here, indeed very, very accurate visually, and they are considered as a prime examples of woodblock prints in 13th century northern China. Okay. So in addition to show the physical details of the medicinal plants, they also exhibit a variety of compositions that is considered as a summary of what Materia Medica images have been going through before the 13th centuries. So from the left to the right, you can see we have a symmetrical composition showing the entire plant. We have a depiction with a focus on the root, because that's usually where the therapeutic function comes from. And we have a single branch of a plant, okay, in this diagonal form. And we also have an image showing the local environs of the growing plants, okay. All of them, to some degree, will help the reader to identify the plants. But some of them clearly share more similarities with painting traditions. So for example, if you are familiar with flower paintings in China, this will remind you of the cut branch composition of the flowers, and the patterns on the rocks clearly show some texture strokes. So again, on the one hand, they are of epistemic functions for identification, but on the other hand, artistic or art historical values is also embedded in these images, okay? And more importantly, I noticed that the emphasis on visual accuracy, however, does not mean that Materia Medica images in Chongxiu or other books were actually results from direct empirical studies. Another preface by the eminent poet in the 13th century Ma Ge and some other colophons in the book suggest that Zhang Cunhui actually modeled this book after an earlier book dated to 1143. Okay? So Zhang and Ma's two statements present interesting dynamics of making illustrated Materia Medica books during this time. On the one hand, visual accuracy did not guarantee direct empirical studies of actual species. Copying earlier works, on the other hand, did not undermine the claimed epistemic function of the book. In the same vein, it's also hard to conclude whether images in earlier Materia Medica books like Bencao Tujing were indeed drawn from living species in nature as it's claimed, or they were actually modeled after contemporary visual materials like paintings or murals. Okay. So while the actual sources and production process of Materia Medica images across different books remain puzzling, I consider their intended epistemic function was envisioned not through the image itself, but through the visual arrangement of the text and images in the book. Okay, so let's take Chongxiu as the most reliable priming example to see some patterns. So throughout the book, the image of each pharmaceutical material appears on the right half of the illustrated page, followed by explanatory text on the left. Okay? I label this way of arranging text and image as the 右图左文 format, or image on the right, text on the left. So how does this 右图左文 format serve the epistemic purpose of illustrating Materia Medica book as the source for pharmacological knowledge? Okay. I think this is determined by the reading experience of Chinese books. 重修 and very likely all the Song books I mentioned so far abound in a format to be read from the right to the left. And as the readers proceed from one page to the next, the image would always appear before the text of the same entry. And one may look at the images without reading the text, but they cannot just read the text without first looking at the preceding images. And to locate a specific entry, one needs to first pinpoint its images. And I take this establishment of 右图左文 format as an important benchmark for the development of Materia Medica images in pre-Ming China. And no matter how the compositions of each different images changes, this format remains consistent across the whole book. Okay. Now at this point, I guess you may wonder, we're here for the manuscripts, but you keep talking about prints. So where is the manuscript? Well, here it is. I want to underscore that the tradition of making hand-painted Materia Medica images did continue through the centuries before the Ming, even with the development of woodblock printing techniques. A work titled Ruiying Gao, or Working the Cliff Materia Medica, with a preface by Lang An, has been identified by book collectors in the 20th centuries. Lang has been identified as a unique painter named Wang Jie in the southern Song. The images, as you can see here, are incredibly detailed with fine lines and saturated colors. However, this extant copy has been identified as a Ming reproduction of the original Song book, and thus I cannot use it to determine whether it fully preserves the original brushwork of Wang Jie. Nonetheless, it evidences the continued practice of making manuscripts of Materia Medica from the Song to the Ming. Okay, here finally, we are in the Ming Dynasty. The largest body of Materia Medica images in historical China survives from the Ming dynasties. And many of you may have been familiar about this time period. The Forbidden City shown here was constructed as the palace complex of the Ming dynasties. So most Materia Medica images made prior to the Ming are lost or only in copies made in the Ming. And the Ming is pivotal because copies of earlier Materia Medica images provide materials to investigate how the Ming people interpreted the past. And at the same time, new creations made in the Ming are indicative to changes and transformations in both the development of Materia Medica and book culture. Okay. So we will start actually at the court in the Forbidden City, but then move to the culturally sophisticated area of the Yangtze Delta or the Jiangnan to see two extraordinary examples of Materia Medica manuscripts. Okay, so let's go to the court first. Okay. Like the Tang and Song dynasties, the Ming Imperial Court also commissioned a state-sponsored Materia Medica treatise titled Bencao Pinhui Jingyao, Collections of Essential Materia Medica. This manuscript was finished in 1505 with assorted information on over 1,800 pharmaceutical materials, and over 1,100 of them are hand-illustrated with meticulous brushwork and vibrant colors, as you can see here. Okay? So editors of this manuscript, who were physicians serving the Ming court at that time, clearly took pride in this richly illustrated and colorful treatise, as you can see from the statement in the preface. But what intrigued me more is that this court-produced book was later copied by a women artist named Wen Shu in the 17th centuries who was active in the Jiangnan area. And it is titled Depictions of Metal Stones, Insects, and Plants, 金石昆虫草木状, as you can see here. And moreover, Wen Shu's work was copied again by two other women artists, the sisters of Zhou Shuxi and Zhou Shuhu, and their work is now known as Bencao Tupu. Okay. The pictorial content and sequence of the images in the two works are almost identical, with only slight differences in colors and sizes. Okay. So the two related works present many intriguing questions about illustrated Materia Medica manuscripts in the Ming. And in the rest of the talk, I will address two. Okay. First, what was the value of copying a book made more than 100 years ago? So I will talk about the value of a manuscript in the Ming. And second, how to understand their significance to the intellectual tradition of Materia Medica. So I will show how each of them actually show different interpretations of Materia Medica as an intellectual tradition and further to human nature relationships. In a sum, although commercial printing and publishing burgeoned in the mid-16th centuries, copying books by hand, especially rare books like Bencao Pinhui Jingyao, embodied a variety of intellectual and cultural values. Hand-copied books were in general considered of better quality, both in content and the use of materials than printed books. For scholars who copied a book, would carefully collate the text and select the paper and ink for writing. Okay, other than that, the printed books were usually mass-produced by commercial houses. And a hand-copied book would also highlight the art of calligraphy, an indicator of the scholarly cultivation and taste of whoever copied or owned the book. In contrast, the standardized script style in many Ming printed books were considered impersonal and mechanical. And the penchant for copying books was even stronger in the case of rare books, especially those unavailable on the market, like the court-produced Pinhui Jingyao. So whoever made a copy of a rare book would proudly announce their new achievement in their circle, attracting admiration from other book seekers, and many requests begging for viewing and making copies. For book collectors, these books were not just compilations of text. Just like masterpieces of calligraphy, they were also artworks and collectible goods. So in light of culture of manuscript and copying books, both 金石昆虫草木状 and 本草图谱 demonstrate a well-preserved tradition of illustrated books of Materia Medica. However, even though 本草图谱 was modeled after 金石昆虫草木状, the two works sharing the same source of images from the court-produced book exhibit different interpretations of Materia Medica and human relationships. So in the following section, I will expound on them one by one to show how they refashioned Materia Medica images for different purposes. So let's do a little bit recap so far, okay? So for all the books we have seen so far, the majority of them produced, whether in or before the Ming, present the perpetuated format of image on the right, text on the left, right? However, significant changes were made in Wen Shu's 金石昆虫草木状. Bencao was not adopted in the title, and the most obvious editorial choice is the removal of the explanatory text from the court treatise Pinhui. Only the captions of each image were kept, and when viewing 金石, one would not be informed about how the fruit can treat your congested nose, ear, or digestive system, as you can read in the text on the left. And as one turns the page, immediately there's another images of, in this case, is of a towel. Okay? So this transformation undoubtedly highlights Wen Shu's ability in painting, but more importantly, I think it unconnected Materia Medica images from Materia Medica text and embodied medical knowledge. In Wen Shu's work, the illustrations are independent to be looked at and considered, one after another for more than 1,000 of them. But then I have another question. What is the context to interpret this change? Why did she want to do that? Okay. So in the preface to 金石昆虫草木状, Wen Shu's husband Zhao Jun highlights their passion for owning natural materials as collectible objects. It says metals and stones, insects, birds and beasts, and plants and trees may be gathered as rarities from heaven and kept as treasures in the human realm. More importantly, he states that the possession of representations of natural materials may satisfy humans' desire to owning them physically. And this work, as we see here, was truly a feast for the eyes. The explicitly expressed yearnings for treasures of mountains and the sea from different regions and exotic lands was not just for personal interests. Natural materials here are considered as valuable goods for collecting purposes. And educated elites, sometimes known as the literati in China, like Wen Shu, Zhao Jun, and their families, has a long and well-documented history of collecting. And in the late Ming period, garden culture, I think, was a particular factor interconnected with it. Ming literati and artists portrayed the garden as a place to cultivate, grow, and display natural species. So consider this detail in our garden painting by Qiu Ying, which was exhibited here in Huntington a short time ago as an example. So the scene depicts the medicinal field in the garden, where each plant is placed one by one in grids and clearly depicted with observable details for identification. And so, for example, we can immediately see the mushroom of immortalities here, but in actual gardening, they do not grow that way, right? So remarkably, Wen Shu and her family residence was a famous garden named Hanshan in the Jiangnan area in the late Ming. The garden itself no longer exists, but we may get a sense of its magnificence from these 18th century paintings. And toward the end of his preface in 金石昆虫草木状, Zhao Jun vividly described Hanshan as a wonderland filled of natural spectacles, as you can read from this quotation. I consider the promotion of their garden Hanshan went hand in hand with the production of 金石昆虫草木状. The garden is described as a three-dimensional space filled with extraordinary species, whereas 金石 was envisioned as a repository built two-dimensionally on paper for the same purposes. Okay. So in short, in 金石, natural materials were no longer regarded as medical substances, but valuable goods to be collected, displayed, and looked at. Materia Medica images no longer functions as visual records for pharmaceutical knowledge, but are refashioned into dazzling images one after another to satisfy human sensual pleasure of looking. So it's truly a visual exhibit to relish. As you can see here, I can never get tired of looking at these images. Okay. However, as soon as we turn our eyes to the Zhou sisters' work, we will notice two differences immediately. First, the title changed again. The word Bencao or Materia Medica was reintroduced. Second, there is an explanatory text for each image written by Zhou Rongqi, the sister's father. No one from the Zhou family left any explanations for such modifications. But because Zhou sisters were Wen Shu's students and they copied images from her work, I consider these changes their deliberate effort to distinguish the purpose of Bencao Tupu. We have just seen in Wen Shu's work that the exclusion of Materia Medica in the title and the removal of all the explanatory texts transformed an illustrated book of medical knowledge into a visual representation of collectible goods. So vice versa, the Zhou family's modification implied their intention to reincorporate Bencao Tupu into the framework of Materia Medica scholarship. And more remarkably, most of the texts were not taken from the court-produced Pinhui, which was the model for Wen Shu's work. Instead, Zhou Rongqi adapted most of the text from Bencao Gangmu, okay, a Materia Medica book published at the end of the 16th century and probably one of the best known Materia Medica book around the world. Okay. So using text from contemporary publications of Materia Medica indicates their awareness of the development of this intellectual field in their contemporary time. And moreover, by adding the text back, the overall layout of Bencao Tupu conforms to the conventional format of image on the right, text on the left, as I have shown earlier in illustrated Materia Medica books. So just to refresh your memory, the printed images on the right is from the 1249 printed Chongxiu. And you can see how the overall layout of image and text in Bencao Tupu actually follows the old models. Okay. So whether such design was an intention to return to this tradition, the effect is that it makes an affirmation to its readers that Materia Medica images should be placed side by side with Materia Medica text to serve the epistemic functions of Materia Medica books. And the latter half of the title, okay, Tupu, further attests to this idea. So what does Tupu mean? It can refer to a variety of visual materials, but the key concept is a set of images paired with texts. Some scholars in historical China promoted Tupu as the best format for recording and transmitting empirical knowledge. With images, they argue the viewer can study the formal features of the objects, and the textual explanations ensure that the accurate and proper interpretations of images and will prevent the reader to get into sensual obsessions just by looking, which is actually what will happen to you if you get to Wen Shu's work. You're just looking at images without thinking about the medical knowledge. Okay. So although the reason of using Tupu in the title is unclear, because as I said, none of the Zhou family members left any explanations, their adoption of this term conveys the message that the Zhou family's illustrated book was associated with a solid academic tradition of knowledge production, especially the combination of image and text for its epistemological importance. And one thing will make it more relevant is their father, Zhou Rongqi, was working closely with the famous book collector Mao Jing, and he worked as assistant to collate all the text and hand-copied many books for Mao Jing. So they have this close and long-standing relationships with a circle of book collectors and knowledge production. So in terms of the title, the selection of the texts, and the design and layout of image and text, Tupu, in contrast to Jinshi Kuncong Caomu Zhuang, was repackaged to be a continuation and enhancement of Materia Medica as intellectual fields. So more research is needed for me to present other examples of illustrated Materia Medica manuscripts, but I hope you have get some sense from my talk today of how diverse they are and how they can point to different interpretations of human nature relationships. So I will stop here because I want to make sure we have enough time for questions, but staying tuned for my future work. And thank you very much for your attendance.
So if you have questions, there are 2 microphones, one here and one at the other end of the room. Please just come up to the microphone directly to pose your questions to Professor Gao. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for a really fascinating talk on one of my favorite subjects. What I'm going to ask might be blindingly obvious, but could you talk a little bit more about the relationship between the Bencao Gangmu and the illustrated manuscripts? Who are the intended audiences for the illustrated manuscripts? And if I understand right, they were not actually printed. Is that correct? So when you switch to the illustrations in the Bencao Gangmu, the illustrations are already at the beginning of the book.
Yes.
And they don't relate directly to the text. And they're also notorious for being really bad illustrations. So could you just kind of talk a little bit more about that relationship between those two sets of images and text? Thanks.
Thank you. So I will first address the illustrations in Bencao Gangmu and then come back to the targeted viewership of the manuscripts. I'm so glad you bring that back, and I have spare slides prepared for it. So as you can see in the first edition of Bencao Gangmu, the images appears to be quite crude, and as the audience mentioned, they are not attached to the text, but they are put in two separate chapters at the beginning of the whole book. There have been controversial dialogues about whether the author Li Shizhen actually wanted images in this. And one possible reason of having the images separated is the publishers decided in the last minute to include images, and they just recycled whatever is on the market to do that. So as you can see, they're quite crude, and their low quality have already been noticed by their contemporary Ming viewers. So in the following two new editions, they have commissioned the new images to accompany the text. So that is one thing, and I think that is why the Zhou families decided to combine images from Wen Shu's work with Bencao Gangmu. They are probably impressed by the scholarly quality of the text, but somehow so disappointed by the images, and they just want to combine the both sides of the strands, whether in artistic productions or book cultures. And yes, unlike printed books, illustrated manuscripts have a relatively limited viewership. In Wen Shu's case, we know the 金石昆虫草木状 was acquired soon after she completed. And in the colophons written by other collectors, they make remarks like people just competed with each other to see this marvelous work. So it was received as really a prime example of this eminent women artists from the eminent Wen family in Suzhou. So a lot of cultural capitals got built in. And later on, the whole set was collected by the Yi prince of the Qing court in the 18th centuries. And so that it certainly remains in a rather elite circle of collectors and viewers. And for Bencao Tupu, we know less, because we didn't know who commissioned it, and was it ever completed? Because in some chapters, we will only see the character for chapter Juan, but they haven't put the number yet. So it is highly likely that one was never completed. And only, I think, 5 chapters have survived till today, and in comparison to Wen Shu's work. But I would say sometimes manuscripts will circulate in an unexpected way, because I always questioned, how did Wen Shu have access to this court-produced book, right? And someone said maybe when his great-great-grandfather, the eminent scholar Wen Zhenming, went to Beijing, he did copy that, but I highly doubt it. And I later on find in an entry of Li Zhihua's diary saying that one day he visited a bookseller in Suzhou on a boat, and who had an entire set of this court-produced Pinhui. So it is suggested the court actually made 2 complete copies. One stayed in the court until 1920s, and one just went outside the court and was already in circulation in 17th century Suzhou. And I think Wen Shu have seen the second copy and decided somehow to acquire it or copy it. So, but I think this makes a really interesting contrast to how far Bencao Gangmu reached, not just in China, but across the world. Thank you.
I'll ask something then. I'm curious about Wen Shu's work more generally. I vaguely remember that Sylvia Lee, when writing about Wen Shu and Zhao Jun, said that actually in some of Wen Shu's copy of that Bencao text, some of the illustrations actually do differ from the original imperial models.
Yep.
And I think Sylvia Lee speculated that Wen Shu might have been painting from life in her garden or painting from life in her collected materials. I wondered if there was any sort of evidence beyond that sort of that speculation about Wen Shu's practice of transforming images, potentially painting from life, or transforming those models.
Yes, yes. So I compared most of them with the court-produced one, and I can see there are differences. And in the preface, Zhao Jun also mentioned they made intentional editorial choices to replace, for example, depictions of ancient bronze or something with their house collections, and depictions of the coral with their house collections. And Sylvia Lee's argument is to underscore their taste and distinctions, right? And let me go back to this slide. Okay, did I have, I have the lotus root here, you see. It is different from the Pinghui, and I haven't located the source of this single image yet, but it was either she is taking inspirations from other paintings, or the copy she looked at was different from the copy that have survived till today. But it occurs to me that even in the woodblock prints, every edition there will be some differences, even some minor differences. And I have another example here. So the court-produced Pinghui is argued to be based most of illustrations on the 1249 edition of Chongxiu. However, this example of the back carp is obviously different. And the fish, it looks familiar, right? They have a painting that probably either down or at the collection of the Ming court. And it presents a very similar compositions to the black carp in Pinghui. So clearly the artist working for the court-produced manuscript were taking inspirations from other places. The interesting and also unfortunate things of many of the book illustrations is we know little about their making process or about their artists. So Wen Shu's case is really exceptional because we actually know something about her, but the 8 court painters who participated in making Pinghui, we only find a few words about 1 or 2 of them, according to my research.
Thank you for a very interesting lecture.
Hi.
I'm wondering, Wen Shu worked at the same time or period as the editor and publisher of the 10 Bamboo Studio of calligraphy and painting. And as you know, there's a whole volume on plants, on fruits, actually. And I wonder if there is any relationship between, there's a sort of surge and popularity of looking at exotic fruits, plants, and I wonder if there were any connections.
Yeah, definitely, and thank you for bringing that up. I remember the 10 Bamboo Studios were published approximately 10 years after the completion of 金石昆虫草木桩. This was completed in 1620, and it was actually the earliest work with Wen Shu's name on it, to my knowledge, so very likely her debut work. And I also got attracted to the comparison because when I'm looking at the images here with the motif painted at the center and so much blank space around it, it immediately reminds me of the letter papers that produced by 10 Bamboo Studio, same time. But I was advised you need more evidence to make that connections. So one thing I think they are clearly be aware of and related to Ten Bamboo Studio is the innovation of color printing or the limits of traditional woodblock prints, because they actually, in the preface, they criticized their contemporary woodblock printing to be lack of colors and lack of good artistic quality. So I'm just bringing some examples of the chrysanthemum in woodblock prints and the chrysanthemum printed by those, and they dare to say their work compared to the stone books are like J2 stones. So very astonished statement to make. And in addition to that, I also found out when Shu herself was participating in copying books. So again, very unfortunate, we know nothing from her own words, but I was able to find out some material saying that she was also participating in hand-copied books. And her family, the Wen Zhenming, they were known as great masters of copying books. And so this Yuqing Shanfang Mount of Jade Chime, this is usually the seal they would press upon the books hand-copied by them. So I think both Hu Zhenyan, the publishers of Ten Bamboo Studios, and elite scholars like this, they were concerned about the limitations of woodblock print at the time. And some went to the way of innovating it for color printing, and some just returned back to the manuscript traditions to, again, underscore their distinctions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the most enlightening talk.
Thank you.
Looks like the imperial government is really very interested in making a good encyclopedia of the herbs and trees and plants, that kind of thing. So do they mean to keep it within the court and don't release it to the public? Mm-hmm. And my question is also, at what time do the medicine people in China learn about the herbs and medicine? Obviously not as complete as the imperial. And my third question is, with DeepSeek and AI, that kind of thing, can you find out more about these things just by typing in, what you want, what is good for?
Okay, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I'm so glad you bring back the relationship between the imperial government and the production of pharmacopoeia. So as you can see, both the Tang and Song imperial governments sponsored pharmacopoeias, and according to historic accounts, the Xinxiu Bencao was produced with a goal to serve as a textbook for medical education across the state. So although that text no longer exists, we know its function is to educate medical practitioners across the state. And the Song medical book sponsored by the imperial government actually went large in quantity of prints, and they were, we know they were given to local schools to educate medical practitioners. And actually there's a great scholar who is doing research on how the Song government regulate the state by printing medical texts. So if anyone's interested, please email me, I will find out that. The funny fact about the Ming produced book is that it never went print. Okay, so, and some scholars speculate that this is actually just made as the draft for the printed book. And the printed book just never got realized for a very bloody and gossipy court incident. So to put in short, the emperor who commissioned this book died suddenly after its completion in 1505. And so his sponsorship did not continue that way. And the court physicians, who were the editors responsible for this book, has long been in conflicts with the scholar officials as the Grand Secretary at the court. So immediately they were criticized to be responsible for the emperor's sudden death, and they were put into jail. Okay? And there is some conflicts going on back and forth, because like the Tang and Song state-sponsored pharmacopoeia, who were the editors? Not the physicians, the scholar officials, because physicians were considered not that great as they are today. Like scholar officials believe they are most, like they're best educated in textual accounts, so they should be in charge of editing all this stuff. But for the Ming versions, somehow the court physicians won the favor of the emperors, and they took charge of this new state-sponsored pharmacopoeia. And soon after the emperor died, all of them were put into jail. And they were sentenced, some of them were sentenced to death penalty, saying that they caused the death of the emperor. So some scholars believed this court conflicts contributes to the result that this book was never published. But I think when it was first commissioned, it certainly has the idea and ambition that it will be an imperial project sponsored by the court, and it will reach a wider audience. And in contrast, this book got just kept in the repository in the Forbidden City until Kangxi, one of Kangxi emperor's scholar official found it, and they made a copy in the Qing dynasties. So there's a really an exceptional case with this one. But other than this book, I know books like the Chongxiu, the 1249, they went large in quantities in prints, and they were issued in provincial or local schools to educate medical practitioners. And as for AI, I don't know how much I can trust it, and because if I trust it, I don't know how much actually I can trust the artist who made the images, because as you can see, we are unclear whether they're actually based on empirical studies. They can make really accurate and highly realistic images just based on copying paintings. And who knows what happens when they are making those images. So my answer, like my answer to all AI developments, is we will see, we will find out. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for that interesting talk.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask a question. I'm not an art historian, so I apologize if this is a little silly. But I was really intrigued by the sudden shift in philosophy for Wenzhou of doing away with the text and really focusing on the collection of just the artwork itself. And you know, it reminds me sort of the botanical illustration tradition that was coming up in Europe at the time as well. And so I'm sort of curious whether there was cross-pollination across China and Europe of these types of illustrated texts that might have influenced her.
Yeah. So this is 17th century, and we know people like Materia Medica, they were already in China from Europe, but I have no evidence that the Wenshu or Zhao Jun were in direct contact with them. But I do know that Zhao Jun himself was very interested in foreign languages, and he was recorded to be a scholar of Sanskrit and many foreign languages. So it will not surprise me if they have encountered some European materials at that time. And it will also not surprise me if they have had contact with like maps produced at that time about the world and Europe. Do I have a slide here for that? Let me see. Yeah, here. So as you can see, they printed all kinds of prints in the Ming, and including the maps, and also this narrative things and in-cake designs. So I would say that their resources for inspirations is way more diverse than we could imagine and find out now. but I have no direct evidence that they were in direct contact with imported materials. I do know that the court-produced book was made in several copies, and many of them went to Europe later in the 18th and 19th century. I have examined a copy in Rome, which was acquired by an Italian missionary in 19th centuries, and he brought that back to Rome. And we also have a copy brought back to Germany in the 19th century. So we know these images actually went abroad quite often, but I don't know whether Wen Shu actually sees some European examples at that time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Another question?
Can I ask one more? I just wondered if you could talk more about the relationship between Wen Shu and the Zhou sisters, since you said the Zhou sisters were her students. What did an apprenticeship for women painters look like at the time?
Yeah. So the only evidence that scholars say the Zhou sisters were her mentees is this work. They copied this work, and we did not know much about Wen Shu's biography or the Zhou sisters' biography. And I did the math a little bit, so if the Zhou sisters did study with Wen Shu and copied the works, they were only at their 10 or 11, so which is quite astounding, right? So, and I checked all the late Ming and early Qing accounts saying that, oh, the Zhou sisters studied Wen Shu. They're all based on the relationships between the two Bencao works. And for the mentorship between women artists, I think probably some of you know Dorothy Cole's book on teachers of inner chambers, and she focuses more on poets and writing women, but she did mention briefly like Wen Shu and Zhou sisters, and she even speculated that Wen Shu traveled outside of Hanshan, otherwise how can she get in contact with the Zhou sisters? But it is not rare that women will form a circle of their own and learn from each other. And it is interesting that Wen Shu's daughter, who has even less accounts in historical texts, she was recognized as an artist as well. And in some early Qing accounts, they said after the Ming collapse, she just went to become a nun and dispersed all their house collections, and there were just urban legends about how talented she was, like her mother. And the Zhou sisters, I believe, one of them has a student whose surname is Yao, because we only know her surname from textual accounts, but that Miss Yao also became recognized as an artist in the Qing period. And even Wen Shu died at a relatively young age, before the Ming collapsed, she became kind of an emblem of talented women artists in the Qing. And there were more Qing women artists who claimed to model after her style and artistic lineage and continue to practice paintings. Other questions?
Thank you for the talk.
Thank you.
Two questions. First, to what extent do you communicate and collaborate with scholars in Taiwan and China? And the second question is, could you elaborate on the other subject matters that you are studying?
Okay, could you repeat your second question? Sorry, I didn't get it.
What are some of the other subject matters you have been studying aside from this?
Okay. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, due to COVID, I haven't been able to travel to China or Taiwan for the past 5 years. So I didn't have much time to collaborate with particular scholars in person, but I did briefly talk to some of them via email or online. And my goal in the coming summer is to go back to China and also to Taiwan to do more research, because Wen Shu's work is actually in the collection of National Library in Taipei. And I'm having email exchange just with the librarians, but I haven't actually gone there to see the things in person. And my other subjects of research, aside from this one, currently I just finished an article on zisha teapots, the purple clay, and the article, a little bit of self-promotion. The article is coming up in June in the Journal of Post-Medieval. So if you are interested in that, I'll share a copy with you. Okay. Did that answer your questions? Okay.
Thank you so much, Professor Gao, for your illuminating talk and your generous responses to all of our questions.
Thank you.
Our next lecture will be on Thursday, March 20th at 2:30 p.m. It's our annual lecture on Japanese tea, and it's being delivered this year by Professor Andrew Watsky of Princeton University. He'll be presenting some of his work on the appreciation of tea ceramics in 16th century Japan, and then our series on medicine will continue in April with 2 talks, one by Lorraine Wilcox, who will be speaking about female practitioners of medicine in the Ming dynasty, and later in the month by Vivian Lowe, who will be talking about the relationships between food and medicine in China. So again, thank you so much, Professor Gao.
Thank you.
And thank you all for your attention today.